Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the History of Scotland podcast. My name is Fraser, and you're tuning in to episode 59, where we'll delve into the fascinating history of the Parliament of Scotland in the 13th century. But before we dive into today's topic, I want to extend an apology for the significant delay in releasing this episode. Life has been incredibly busy with work commitments, and unfortunately I haven't had the time to dedicate to script writing. However, I am thrilled to say that we're back, and fingers crossed, this time our schedule is now back on track. Also, another note, Echoes of the Emperors, that is Echoes of the Emperors, a card-based Age of Empires style board game, is now live on Kickstarter. There is a link in the description. Please go check it out. I have been working with the game developers on fleshing out the Scottish side, making sure it's all historically accurate, etc. I mentioned it a few episodes back, and it's finally released on Kickstarter. They were requesting up to £8,000. Well, that's the converted amount to fund the game, and it's already reached nearly £40,000, which is an insane amount of money. So it's really cool to see how popular it's going, and just go check it out. Again, it's Echoes of the Emperors on Kickstarter now, and I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, in our last two episodes, we took a bit of a detour to catch up with the Scottish noble families during the reign of Alexander II. These episodes were essential as they helped us set the stage for the upcoming Wars of Independence. Understanding the dynamics and the key players among the nobility during Alexander II's reign, and also the start of Alexander III's reign, provides us with a solid foundation as we move forward into our historical narrative. This week, as mentioned, we're shifting our focus to the Scottish Parliament in the early to late 13th century. We'll explore what role it played in Scotland at this crucial time, how it differed from its English counterpart, and highlight any significant events and decisions that took place within its chambers. The 13th century was a period of significant political evolution and development, and the Parliament of Scotland was at the heart of this transformation. So what was the Parliament of Scotland? How did it come into being, and what functions did it serve? We'll also compare the Scottish Parliament with the English side as mentioned. While both institutions evolved during the same period, they developed distinct characteristics and served different functions within their respective kingdoms. The English Parliament had its unique structure and methods of operation, which we'll touch upon to highlight the contrasts and similarities. Throughout this episode, we'll explore the significant events and decisions made by the Scottish Parliament, from enacting laws that shaped the daily lives of Scots to its judicial functions and advisory role to the King. The Parliament was a central institution in medieval Scotland. Learning about all of this and more will provide us with a deeper understanding of Scotland's political landscape during the 13th century. So, without further ado, let's jump back into the early 13th century and uncover the intriguing history of the Parliament of Scotland. To truly understand the origins and the structure of the Parliament of Scotland, we need to delve into the historical context of the 13th century. The political landscape of Scotland was shaped by a series of significant events and involving governance structures that laid the foundation to the establishment of Parliament. The early 13th century, as we know, had King Alexander reign from 1214 to 1249, and then his son Alexander III would come to the throne, and when he came to the throne he was in his minority. This period was characterised by a need for greater administrative organisation and the involvement of various societal factions in the governance process. It was against this backdrop that the Parliament of Scotland began to take shape as an important institution. Before the formal establishment of the Parliament of Scotland, Scotland's governance was primarily based on a feudal system. The king relied heavily on the Council of Nobles and Clergy, known as the Great King's Council, to make decisions and administer the realm. This council was not a formalised body like a modern parliament, but rather a gathering of the most powerful and influential individuals in the kingdom. It served as an advisory body to the king, helping him make important decisions regarding laws, justice and administration. The evolution from this council to a more structured parliamentary system was gradual. One of the critical developments was the inclusion of representatives from different societal groups, which began to formalise the idea of a parliament. The increasing complexity of the kingdom's administration and the need to address issues that affected various segments of society necessitated a more organised and representative body. By the mid-13th century, the concept of the Free Estates began to take hold. This idea was borrowed from the European models of governance, where the clergy, or the clerics, the nobility, or the lay tenants-in-chief, and the commoners, who were known as a borough commissioners, were representative in a formal assembly. In Scotland, this led to a formation of a more structured parliament that included these three distinct groups, each bringing their perspectives and interests to the table. The clerics represented the powerful, influential church, playing a significant role in shaping decisions, especially those related to moral and spiritual matters. The lay tenants-in-chief, who were more major landholders and feudal lords, brought their concerns about land, feudal rights and military obligations. The borough commissioners represented the growing towns and boroughs, voiced the interests of merchants and townspeople, reflecting the increasing importance of commerce and urban centres in Scottish society. The evolution towards a more inclusive and representative governance structure culminated in the establishment of a formal parliament. By the end of Alexander III's reign in 1286, obviously in our future, the Parliament of Scotland had become an essential institution in the kingdom, reflecting the complex and multifaceted nature of medieval Scottish society. It was not just a legislative body, but a forum for negotiation, decision-making, and the balancing of power among the different estates of the realm. But what were these three estates in more detail? Well, if we touch upon the clerics again, the clerics were representing the religious arm of medieval Scottish society. They were pivotal members of Parliament. They were typically high-ranking church officials such as bishops and abbots who wielded considerable influence due to the church's substantial landholdings and spiritual authority. The clerics played several crucial roles within the Parliament. They provided moral and ethical guidance on legislation, ensuring that laws aligned with Christian teachings and values. Their deep involvement in education and literacy also meant they often acted as scribes and advisors on complex legal and administrative matters. The influence of the church on parliamentary decisions was profound. As the primary institution responsible for moral and spiritual welfare of the kingdom, the church's views carried significant weight. Laws concerning marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct were heavily influenced by the ecclesiastical principles. Moreover, the church's extensive network of parishes and monasteries across Scotland made the clerics powerful intermediaries between the crown and the common people. This network allowed them to gather and relay information, thereby shaping parliamentary discussions and decisions. What about lay tenants-in-chief? Well, they were major landholders and feudal lords of Scotland. They were granted large estates directly by the king, as we know, and they held significant military and administrative responsibilities. Their land ownership and social status provided them with considerable power and influence. As the backbone of the feudal system, they were responsible for raising the armies, administering justice, and ensuring the king's laws were enforced. Their status also meant they could command loyalty from lesser nobles and knights, further extending their influence within Parliament. And then there was the Borough Commissioners. The Borough Commissioners were representatives of Scotland's towns and boroughs. They were selected from among the leading citizens and merchants of these urban centres. The process of selection varied, but typically involved local elections or appointments by town councils. The inclusion of borough commissioners in the Parliament was a significant development, reflecting the growing importance of commerce and urban life in medieval Scotland. Their presence in Parliament was significant for several reasons. Firstly, they provided a voice for the commercial and urban interests, which were becoming increasingly important to Scottish economies. Issues such as trade regulations, market rights and urban governance were brought to the parliamentary table by the commissioners. Secondly, their involvement marked a shift towards a more inclusive and representative form of governance. By representing the boroughs, the parliament acknowledged the economic contributions and the needs of the towns, which were essential for the kingdom's prosperity. But don't get this confused with actual commoners going to Parliament and fighting for the little man. We're still not there yet. The interaction between the three estates were fundamental to the functioning of Parliament. Each estate brought its unique perspective and interests, which had to be balanced and negotiated to achieve consensus. Conflicts among the three estates were inevitable given their different priorities. For instance, the lay tenants-in-chief might resist new taxes proposed by the borough commissioners, who sought to fund infrastructure projects beneficial to trade. The clerics might oppose laws that conflicted with the church doctrines, even if they were economically advantageous. However, these conflicts also led to collaborations and compromises, which were essential for effective governance. The balancing of power among the three estates ensured that no single group could dominate the parliament entirely. This balance fostered a system of checks and balances, where each estate had to consider the other's interests to achieve their goals. It was this dynamic interplay that made the Parliament of Scotland a unique and evolving institution during the 13th century. Now, we've already mentioned the King's Great Council, also known as the Magnum Concilium, which was an assembly convened by the Scottish monarch. Its main purpose was to advise the king on matters of state, provide counsel on significant legal and political issues, and assist in administration of the realm. The council acted as a core advisory body, guiding the king in decisions that required the input and support of the most influential figures in the kingdom. In contrast, the Parliament of Scotland had a broader and more formalised role. It not only advised the king, but also served as a legal body to enact laws and resolve legal and economic matters to social and political concerns. This formal legal function distinguished the Parliament form from the King's Great Council, which was more focused on intermediate and practical advice to the monarch. The decision-making process of the King's Great Council were relatively informal compared to those of Parliament. The council meetings were convened at the King's discretion, often to address intermediate issues or crises. Decisions were made through discussions and consensus among the members, with the King having the final say. The nature of these meetings were more about providing intermediate counsel and support to the King, rather than enacting formal legal legislation. In contrast, the Parliament followed a more formalised procedure. It convened at regular intervals, and its sessions were often pre-planned to address a range of issues. The process involved proposals, debates and votes by the representatives of the three estates. Laws enacted by the Parliament required the agreement of all three groups, reflecting a more democratic and systematic approach to decision making. This process ensured that the legislation was thoroughly considered and had the support of a broader spectrum of society. The types of issues addressed between the two groups would vary. The Great King's Council was more involved in military strategy, foreign diplomacy, major judicial matters and King's personal directives. Parliament dealt with a wide range of issues compared to this. This dealt with the creation of new laws, editing existing laws, the matters of taxation. Parliament also dealt with societal problems, to do with the great clans and the normalisation, or at least the feudalisation, of Scottish society. But what was this legislative authority? How did it actually enact the laws? Well, the Parliament of Scotland in the 13th century wielded significant legislative authority. It was responsible for enacting laws and regulations that governed various aspects of Scottish society. These laws covered a wide range of issues, as we said, including land ownership, trade regulation, feudal duties, and the rights and responsibilities of different social classes. For instance, the Parliament might pass a law regarding the inheritance of land, which were crucial in a feudal society where land was a primary source of wealth and power. Trade regulations were also essential, especially as boroughs and towns grew in importance, necessitating rules to facilitate commerce and protect merchants. The impact of these laws on the daily lives of Scots were profound. For example, regulations on trade could determine the economic prosperity of towns and influence the availability and prices of goods. Laws regarding land ownership and inheritance affected the social and economic stability of noble families and commoners alike. The decisions made by Parliament played a crucial role in shaping this social landscape and economic landscape, ensuring order and addressing the needs and grievances of its people. In addition to its legal role, the Parliament of Scotland also held significant judicial powers. It functioned as the highest court of appeal in the land, dealing with cases that were beyond the jurisdiction of local courts. This included disputes involving land, inheritance, and breaches of feudal duty, which were often complex and required a higher authority to resolve. The judicial role of Parliament differed from other legal institutions in its ability to provide a final resolution to these disputes. Local courts, presided over by sheriffs or barons, handled everyday legal matters, but their decisions could be appealed to Parliament. This system was crucial in maintaining a unified front and ensuring that justice was administered fairly across the kingdom. The Parliament's decisions in these cases set precedents that shaped Scottish law and provided consistency in its application. But the Parliament also played an essential advisory role to the king. It served as a forum where the monarch could seek counsel from the representatives of the free estates. This advisory function was particularly important in times of crisis, or when significant decisions needed to be made, such as matters of war, diplomacy, or internal reforms. The king's relationship with Parliament was instrumental in governance. By consulting with Parliament, the king could gauge the opinions and support of the nobility, clergy, and boroughs. This consultation helped the monarch make informed decisions that were more likely to gain acceptance and cooperation from these influential groups. The advisory role also provided a platform for the estates to express their concerns and suggest policies, fostering a sense of participation and shared governance. For instance, during Alexander III's reign, the Parliament's advice was sought on matters such as securing the kingdom's borders and negotiating treaties. The king's willingness to listen and incorporate the Parliament's counsel strengthened his rule and helped maintain stability. This collaborative relationship between the king and Parliament was a hallmark of Scottish governance in the 13th century, reflecting a balance of power that facilitated effective administration and political cohesion. Now, the typical venues for parliamentary sessions in 13th century Scotland were often royal castles or ecclesiastical centres that could accommodate large gatherings. Prominent locations included Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, and Scone Abbey. These sites were chosen for their strategic and symbolic importance, as well as their capacity to host the king, his court, and the representatives of the free estates. The choice of location significantly impacted the proceedings of the Parliament. Holding sessions at royal castles reinforced the authority and presence of the monarchy, while ecclesiastical venues underscored the influence of the church in state affairs. The accessibility of these locations was also a factor, as they needed to be reachable for various representatives travelling from different parts of the kingdom. Furthermore, the ambience and facilities of these venues could affect the conduct of the sessions, with more formal and grandiose settings possibly encouraging a greater sense of decorum and gravity in the proceedings. So forget about hosting anything north and in the Great Highlands of Scotland. You're not going to get many people travelling up there in medieval Scotland. The frequency and duration of parliamentary sessions in medieval Scotland varied. The Parliament did not have a fixed schedule and was convened by the king as needed. Typically, sessions were called to address pressing issues such as matters of national security, significant legal disputes, or major initiatives. On average, the Parliament might meet once or twice a year, though this frequency could increase during times of crisis or political turbulence. The duration of these sessions could also vary wildly. Some meetings lasted only a few days, focusing on specific issues, while others extended for weeks to allow for more comprehensive discussions and decisions. Throughout the 13th century, several notable sessions of the Parliament of Scotland made decisions that significantly shaped the kingdom's future. One such session occurred in 1237. If you remember, during the reign of Alexander II, Parliament helped deal with the Treaty of York, which established the border between Scotland and England, a crucial step in securing the kingdom's territorial integrity. This treaty was a landmark decision, reflecting the Parliament's role in diplomatic negotiations and the maintenance of peace with neighbouring countries. Another significant session took place in 1284 during the reign of Alexander III, again in our future. This parliament addressed the issue of succession. Following the tragic death of Alexander III's children, the estates acknowledged Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as the heir presumptive to the Scottish throne. This decision was pivotal as it aimed to ensure a smooth succession and prevent potential crisis of leadership, although it ultimately led to the succession crisis following Alexander III's death in 1286. And obviously in 1286 it did play a massive role in the whole bringing Edward Longshanks up into Scotland to help deal with who would become King of Scotland. These sessions and decisions highlight the Parliament's integral role in addressing critical issues that affected the kingdom's stability and governance. By involving representatives from the three estates, the Parliament ensured that a broad spectrum of society had a voice in these crucial decisions, thereby enhancing the legitimacy and acceptance of its resolutions. But we know it wasn't just Scotland that had a great parliament. In England, the development of parliament followed a somewhat different trajectory. The English parliament can trace its roots back to the early Anglo-Saxon war group, an assembly of nobles and clergy that advised the king. However, the landmark moment for the English Parliament came with the signing of Magna Carta in 1215, which established the principle that the king could not levy taxes without the consent of his council. This led to the formation of a more structured and representative body, with a model Parliament of 1295 often cited as a foundational moment, marking the inclusion of commoners alongside the nobility and clergy. The main factors driving the formation of each parliament included the need for royal consent in matters of taxation, the influence of feudal systems, and the evolving concepts of governance and representation in the kingdom. The composition of members in the Scottish Parliament differed notably from that of the English Parliament. In Scotland, as we know, we have the three estates. In contrast, the English Parliament evolved into a bicratic system consisting of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords included the higher nobility and the senior clergy, while the House of Commons represented the common people, including knights and burgesses from the towns and shires. This division allowed for a more structured and distinct representation of different societal classes, with the Commons gradually gaining more power and influence over time. The implications of these three differences were profound. In Scotland, the inclusion of the borough commissioners alongside the clergy and nobility fostered a more unified but diverse representation within a single parliamentary chamber. In England, the separation into two houses allowed for a more clear distinction between the rich, powerful nobles of England and the more common elements, which would lead to a more, rival approach, let's say. The dynamics between the two chambers led to a lot of rivals, led to a lot of problems, and I'm sure anyone of English history knowledge will tell you about the many different revolts that would come of this. The powers of the Scottish Parliament were similar in some respects to those of the English Parliament, but there were notable differences. The Scottish Parliament had the authority to enact laws, levy taxes, and address issues of national importance, much like its English counterpart. However, its processes were less formalised, and its meetings were often convened as needed rather than on a regular schedule. In England, the powers were more formally structured, especially following the establishment of the model parliament. The English Parliament's ability to legislate was more robust, and over time it developed a more systematic approach to lawmaking. The House of Commons in particular gained significant power in approving taxation and expenditure, which became a cornerstone of English constitutional development. Judicially, the Scottish Parliament also served as the highest court, as we know. This was similar to the English court, where the House of Lords served as the highest court of appeal. However, the judicial functions in Scotland were more intertwined with its legislative sessions, reflecting a less distinct separation of powers compared to the more developed legal structures in England. How about its interactions with the monarch? Well, the relationship between the Scottish monarch and the king was characterised by a delicate balance of power and mutual dependence. The king relied on Parliament for counsel, support and consent. In return, the Parliament sought for the king's approval for its decisions and laws. In England, the relationship between Parliament and the monarch was similarly complex, but evolved more distinctly towards a system of checks and balances. The signing of the Magna Carta was a pivotal moment, establishing the principle that the king could not rule entirely by himself. Over time, the English Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, gained more power in limiting the monarch's authority, leading to significant constitutional developments that shaped the future of English governance. The dynamics of power and influence between the parliaments and their respective monarchs were influenced by these interactions. In Scotland, the king's ability to govern effectively often depended on his relationship with the powerful lords and clergy, as well as the emerging urban interests. In England, the increasing power of the Commons and the framework it established was more important for the monarch to control, leading to a more balanced and representative system of governance. Also, in England, the political landscape was shaped by ongoing conflicts between the monarchy and the barons, leading to significant milestones like the Magna Carta. The larger and more diverse population, combined with the economic power of its towns and cities, necessitated a more structured and representative parliamentary system. The gradual development of a massive parliament with distinct legislative powers reflected the complex and evolving political landscape of medieval England compared to medieval Scotland. The long-term impact of the 13th century parliaments on later political institutions in Scotland and England were profound. In Scotland, the parliament's evolution into a more formalised institution laid the groundwork for its role in later centuries, particularly during the Wars of Independence and beyond. The inclusion of diverse societal groups in governance fostered a tradition of representation that would influence Scotland's political development. In England, the early parliament set the stage for significant constitutional changes, including the eventual establishment of a more democratic and balanced system of government. The development of a two-party-based system with distinct roles for the House of Commons and the House of Lords influenced the structure of modern parliamentary systems around the world. The principles of representation, consent for taxation, and checks on monarchical power established during the 13th century became cornerstones of English and then British constitutional law. While the Scottish and English parliaments shared common roots in medieval traditions of council and governance, their development diverged significantly due to the differing political and social and cultural contexts during each kingdom's time. The structure, powers and interactions with the monarchy of each parliament reflected these differences, shaping their respective legacies and influencing the development of modern parliamentary systems and beyond. Well, that's the end of our touch on the Scottish Parliament during the 13th century. We will revisit this subject many times, especially during the Wars of Independence and as we progress through Scottish history. So don't worry, you haven't heard the last of the Scottish Parliament. But to give you some sources to have a bit of a read if you are interested, one essential book for understanding the history of Parliament is The Scottish Parliament, a Historical Introduction by Alan R. MacDonald. There is also another important work which is called Scotland, a History, which was edited by Jenny Wormold. There is also different articles that you can take a look at. There is The Medieval Scottish Parliament by Keith Brown. There is also Representation and the Scottish Parliament by Ronald Tanner. And then finally, from chroniclers themselves, we've got one important collection, you could say, is the Acts of Parliaments of Scotland, which compiles the legislative acts passed by Parliament. These documents provide direct evidence of the laws enacted, the issues addressed, and the decisions made by Parliament. There is also the Chronica Gentis Scoticorum by John Forden, our man, the myth, the amazing historian that's been following us throughout our episodes so far. He has some important sources relating to the Scottish Parliament. And then there's other records of parliamentary sessions that you can have a look at online. For example, I touched upon the 1284, the Treaty of York, etc. All these records are available online, National Records of Scotland, or in the National Library of Scotland. They hold these records, so definitely give them a look, as, well, I found it interesting to take a read myself. Anyway, as mentioned, that was very fun and interesting. In researching for this episode, I found it incredibly fascinating to learn about the Scottish Parliament. As an Englishman, I'm always told about how crucial our English Parliament was, but it was really interesting to learn how big the Scottish Parliament was in Scottish society. I know we haven't mentioned it as much, but that's because the key difference is the English Parliament had more of a hold over the king, whereas the Scottish Parliament in Scotland is more of an advisory role, so it doesn't actually hold proper power unless the king calls upon it and enacts the laws that are mentioned. But as I said, when we get to the Wars of Independence, they will go from taking a back seat to a more primary role in our story. Anyway, next week we'll do one last special episode focusing on the lords, clans and merchants in the 13th century. This episode will help us understand the social and economic structures that underpin Scottish society during this time, which we were obviously touching upon in this episode. After that, we will finally return to our narrative with King Alexander III and his minority, delving back into the intricate web of medieval Scottish history. Our podcasts are released weekly when they are on time, with our next episode scheduled for next week. Fingers crossed it gets released on time. As always, we aim to deliver 3 episodes a month, providing you with a constant flow of engaging and informative content. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at The History of SC1. That is at The History of SC1, or like our Facebook page, The History of Scotland Podcast, to stay updated on new releases and engage with our community. As mentioned, please do check out Echoes of the Emperors if you're interested in a cool Age of Empires style board game. Link is in the description. If you've enjoyed this episode, please also leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for all the 5-star reviews in the US. We're on a rating of 4.4 out of 5. I've seen all the 5-star reviews come in. Really appreciate it. As always, your feedback helps us improve and reach a wider audience. Our podcasts are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and many other great podcasting sites. But until next week, guys, stay safe, have a great week ahead, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Peace.